To take this conversation further, I'm joined by development economist Dr Jason Musyoka. Dr Musyoka, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us. My first port of call really is the tone or demeanour of President William Ruto. He certainly seems to have been forced to eat some humble pie based on the many conversations that he's had, certainly with the media.
Indeed. I think that consider the fact that he was really responding to a crisis clearly across the country. And initially, I think there was still pushback from government. There were, some musings from government that this was simply a passing storm or passing wind, and the protests would not really take root. There were a lot of emerging discontent from the time that the finance bill, the 2024, was proposed. But I think progressively, they clearly, the government recognized that the upsurge was here to stay, or at least until there was a reaction from government. So yes, I think clearly, there was a going back from the government side and moderating otherwise the hard line that they were taking initially.
So what are the immediate economic impacts of that proposed 177 billion shilling budget cut on public services and development projects?
Right. So firstly, the government is heavily indebted to IMF, in particular upwards of $3.9 billion that were borrowed by previous administrations. And the current administration has been trying to reduce the otherwise large, deficit. And this is, they managed to reduce, at least with there are two options economically that one could look at. The one is to raise taxes, which increases your revenue, therefore you are able to pay for your debts. The second one is budget cuts, so that you do away with wasteful expenditure. And those two were what was proposed by the finance bill. What we have seen, however, clearly after now the whole tax hike proposal was no longer on the table, then the government turned to budget cuts. And here we are looking at cuts on education, for example. And there's a list of thousands of intern teachers who were to be employed under the new finance bill if there was enough taxes. So that's already been scrapped off. But I think government has turned inward to look at where the leakages are as far as government expenditure is concerned. And as you rightly pointed out, I think what is perhaps more telling of the whole proposal on budget cuts is the fact that you're looking at the scrapping off of 47 parastatals that government said that we are going to do away with those and merge with others. Of course, they are going to absorb the government workers in those parastatals to other ministries and so on. But that was probably the big part or factor in this whole budget cuts. But again, there are several others such as non-essential services that are no longer going to be funded. You're also not going to see ministers or members of parliament doing just travels as they would do outside of the country without, as long as they are not really essential. So there are those other minor cuts, but the major one was the cutting of 47 corporations. That is going to affect, Hugo, in a way, delivery of services. It's a quid pro quo. It's where you're cutting, expenditure on one side, but on the other, you really are looking at the fact that you are no longer able to deliver some of the services delivered by these parastatals.
So how much of this reaction is a knee-jerk reaction? Because from your suggestions, I mean, you obviously cut back on expenditure, and in that you incur poor service delivery, and potentially you get the Gen Z back on the streets, or certainly other players in the country opposed to these challenges. So do you get the sense that the Kenyan government and President William Ruto have taken sufficient time to go through and execute a plan that would work?
At the moment, clearly it was dealing or balancing between the economics and the politics. The politics, they really had to pacify the young people so that they get off the streets. And I think that some of these big announcements that were coming out that were so sudden, obviously, that was more political. But I think economically also there is intention. Otherwise, the government is President Ruto was very much adamant that we needed to get out of this debt trap that the country is in. And we've seen countries like Ghana, Zambia, and others that have defaulted on their IMF debts. And the current administration was careful not to go that route. So I think there is also that economic aspect of trying to see how the unnecessary expenditure is reduced. And therefore, we still, in fact, when you look at the projections now of the current budget cuts, it still does manage to reduce the deficit in terms of debt to GDP from 5.7% to 4.9%. So just the budget cuts alone. So I think there is the economic aspect, which we see there is some impact there in terms of debt to GDP reduction.
Now, there have been mounting calls by this Gen Z movement to deal with issues of corruption. Have issues of corruption been factored into potential savings? Have there been any conversations by President William Ruto to deal with those that are siphoning money out of the fiscus?
Corruption in Kenya is deeply entrenched, and the former president, the third president, Mwai Kibaki, he managed to try and deal with corruption, but clearly it got out of control. And we've seen the endemic corruption in government entity and private entities. So it's very difficult to deal with. But that being said, there is one cultural practice in Kenya, which is that you have members of parliament, they organize this kind of fundraisers in public, and that has been condemned by the public, including by the current Gen Z protesters, as one of the key sources of corruption. Because where do they get the money? They earn not a lot of money, but they're able to give so much money in public through fundraising. So the president's speech scrapped that off, and therefore one of the reforms is that no public official is supposed to get involved, or at least to guide public fundraising. And I think that might be just one step. But I think the problem, in my view, is much broader than that. One needs to see that corruption is endemic in Kenya across all the sectors. So it's difficult to deal with that. And yes, there was a lot of pressure from the public that corruption is really the main reason why you have a government that is collecting taxes that are not delivering services. So it's a cycle, but I don't think that there are sufficient measures, in my view, of addressing corruption. It's a long-term goal, in my view, but I perhaps would like to see much more deliberate, long-term planning and detailed planning on how you deal with corruption, perhaps from young kids in schools all the way to the time that they get to the labor market.
Should President William Ruto and other African leaders be having conversations about the cost of borrowing money from these Bretton Woods institutions? Because the cost of borrowing is not sustainable. Should they be contemplating other options on how they can borrow and finance the various budget deficits?
Clearly, there are emerging dynamics, though, with the BRICS institutions and the BRICS particularly setting up their own bank in Johannesburg here. So the idea is to try and counterweight IMF. And the reason is simple. It's that IMF's and World Bank's conditions, or conditionalities as we call them, are very adverse to developing countries versus developed countries. And the President Ruto and a lot of other African presidents have been on the forefront. Paul Kagame, I know of Rwanda, has been also in the same cohort, arguing that these institutions are too punitive and therefore we should look elsewhere to borrow money as Africans. But the irony is that regardless of the rhetoric that is going out, whether from President Ruto or Paul Kagame in South Africa has also made the same argument, unfortunately, we still have the highest debt to the IMF and the World Bank. So until there is a proper alternative, which I think that BRICS comes closer to that, but it's still too small and it's still too early. But they should certainly look elsewhere for borrowing, and also to address this issue that you rightly pointed out, Hugo, of corruption. Because with that, what we do is that we have so much wasted revenue that does not really go to help the the electorate. So I think that if we deal with corruption, we create efficient government systems, then of course you have deficits that reduce, and you don't have to borrow the huge amount of money which you have to service with huge part or chunk of the GDP, which currently African countries are doing.
Now, a lot of economies in the African continent are floundering. Does intracontinental trade offer a possible lifeline?
The AfCFTA has been really up to this point since 2018 when it was launched. It's been a failed to launch process because the kinds of nationalisms that we see, and perhaps also regionalisms where regions are still clustered. South Africa, for example, is not part of COMESA. And that means if you're exporting anything from South Africa to COMESA countries, you have to pay tariffs, higher tariffs. And you have also the Western Africa that is not necessarily very well integrated. It's really broken and fragmented, given the case of Niger and Burkina Faso and so on. East Africa, still not much more cohesion. So the question is how you can create a continental framework of economics, which is trade, and while at the same time you have fragmented political units. And I think that has been the key question of most of the debates on the table now. I think that if we have the regional blocs themselves that are much more integrated, that's one school of thought that argues that perhaps we need to move faster to ensure that the regional blocs are more stable economically and politically. And it would be easy, therefore, to link one region to another. At the moment, even in South Africa, the debate between Zimbabwe and South Africa and how we trade is on the table, and yet it's a next door neighbor. So these issues have a lot to do, and they cross-cut between the economics and the politics. And I think politicians need to move faster to organize their politics and regional politics, and perhaps we can have a much more successful trade agreement. But it's on the table. It's not really had any meaningful start off at the moment.
And finally, the one conversation that we didn't have is how young people are going to accept the proposed changes given by President William Ruto, because it would appear that not many of them suggest a reduction in unemployment numbers.
So, Hugo, we are sitting with both an advantage and a disadvantage. And this, I would like perhaps to project this to the rest of the continent, that it's the youngest continent in terms of the labor force. The population around the continent is approximately aged at about between 35 and 39 years old, compared to most other regions in the world who are experiencing a demographic decline, including China, by the way. Now, the advantage is that by 2050, you'll have Africa providing or supplying the largest labor force in the world. And therefore, essential workers and technical workers are going to come from this continent. That's a good thing. But the underbelly of that is what we've seen in Kenya. The fact that you have realities on the ground and expectations that are not met, and youth that don't have a lot of opportunity cost to lose because they are not employed. They can still protest and go back home and eat, unlike workers who have to think about how they are going to make money. So they have the time in their hands, they have the energy, and they have the frustration. So the time bomb is there if politicians or governments don't move quickly to create employment. And back to the issue in Kenya, I don't think that there's a quick fix as far as employment is concerned. And perhaps if I may, just very quickly, in Kenya, the crisis we see now of unemployed youth was created by good intentions by the third administration, which is President Kibaki's administration. What it did is that it opened up free education, primary education. So we have 100% transition rate from primary to secondary. The problem now is unintended, where you have uneducated youth and we've not created employment for them. So now we are facing, or the country is facing, that crisis of the unintended consequence of educated youth without opportunities. That's a long haul. Government need to be very deliberate, but also mobilize the private sector to create a pathway for youth employment in particular.